Good evening, everyone. We begin the readout tonight 1 week since a depraved 18-year-old walked into Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas, and took the lives of 19 defenseless fourth graders and 2 of their brave teachers. This week begins the next phase for the devastated community as families and friends begin to say their goodbyes to their loved ones who should be starting their summer vacations and celebrating birthdays, not being eulogized. Today, the first 2 children, Amerie Jo Garza and Maite Rodriguez, were laid to rest. As this city grieves over such an unthinkable act and many questions remain unanswered, we are also looking toward the country's elected leadership to finally take a stand and do something, anything, to help curb this endless cycle of senseless loss. In just the past week since the Uvalde massacre, there have been 18 more mass shootings across this country, according to the Gun Violence Archive, in places like Fresno, California, Chattanooga, Tennessee, Benton Harbor, Michigan, and Taft, Oklahoma. We just had the funerals for the victims in Buffalo, Houston, and Laguna Woods, California. Now, many more burials are being planned. In fact, there have been 231 mass shootings so far this year, more than 1 per day. Just let that sink in. So how would a rational country react to tragedy after tragedy committed with the use of the same weapons of war almost every time? How about expanding background checks, banning hundreds of types of military-style weapons, starting a gun buyback program, banning the sale and transfer of large-capacity magazines, or creating new red flag laws, allowing courts to require that people considered a danger to themselves or others surrender their firearms to police? That would be a good start, right? Well, you know who is doing that after the latest tragedy in Texas? Canada. And their death rate due to gun violence is a fraction of what it is here in the United States, even though Canadians have lots of guns, too. But when it comes to our guns, this country is anything but rational. The NRA continues to have its stranglehold over the Republican Party. And so we continue the cycle from Columbine to Sandy Hook to Parkland and now in Uvalde of what can only be described as nothing less than nearly complete inaction, just thoughts and prayers and stasis. Even something like universal background checks, with nearly 90% support from Americans, has repeatedly failed. So once again, we are compelled to ask if this time will be any different. President Biden remains optimistic that this could be the time. He tends to be an optimistic guy. He sees the chance for what he calls rational Republicans to act on gun reforms, adding that the Second Amendment was never absolute. Today, he again pointed to the fact that we all can agree on a lot of these tragedies could have been prevented.
There's an expression by an Irish poet that says, "Too long a suffering makes a stone of the heart." Well, there's an awful lot of suffering. I've been to more mass shooting aftermaths than I think any president in American history, unfortunately. And it's just so much of it is preventable, and the devastation is amazing.
Okay, Mr. President, we'll see. By the way, the person sitting next to the president is New Zealand's Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, who in 2019 was able to pass a sweeping nationwide ban on most semi-automatic weapons after the deadly terrorist attacks on 2 mosques in Christchurch that left 51 people dead, an attack that inspired American mass shooters like the one in Buffalo. But New Zealand, they acted, because that is how a rational country responds to an horrific attack. Joining me now is Mara Gay, member of the New York Times editorial board and an MSNBC contributor, and Tim Wise, anti-racism educator and author of Dispatches from the Race War. Thank you all for being here. And Mara, you know, there is some rational action that is happening. You had Vice President Harris call for an assault weapons ban. Let's play that.
We are not sitting around waiting to figure out what the solution looks like. You know, we're not looking for a vaccine. We know what works on this. It includes, let's have an assault weapons ban. An assault weapon is a weapon of war with no place in a civil society.
And Amara, even Walmart has acted on gun reform. You know, they used to sell AR-15s at Walmart. You used to be able to walk into a Walmart and just buy one. But in 2015, Walmart stopped selling them, and they've stopped selling bump stocks, which you also could buy at Walmart because it's a rifle, which seems bananas, but you could, and they now won't do it. That all is rational, but nothing's going to happen, right? Because we're not in a rational system.
Well, I think a lot of us are living in a rational world, and that's why we're so deeply disturbed by what's happening in this country. The problem is that Congress is not rational and functional, and in particular, the Senate is deadlocked for the reason that we have a minoritarian government at the moment. And so this is really all about what the Senate can do, and it's also about whether we can marshal, and we meaning everybody from Walmart to responsible gun owners to people who never want to see or come into contact with a gun in their entire lives, whether we can marshal the political capital and the cultural capital to continue to keep up pressure on lawmakers and on Congress to actually move something and make it happen. Because what's happening is that Republicans in the Senate are essentially counting on Democrats' inability or disinterest in forcing their hand. And I think they're hoping that the American people will just move on. And of course, we can't just move on because people are being killed in the streets, children, adults, lives being lost every day to gun violence. So increasingly, Americans are, every American is increasingly invested in this issue. And so it shouldn't be this way. But the question is, how do we get the political capital to force their hand and to end the filibuster so that we can see action?
Right. I mean, Tim, look, I mean, Canada is very culturally not that dissimilar from the United States. It's right next to us. And they're able to just make this decision. And you have the prime minister tweeting about the changes they're going to make, which makes sense, right? There are countries like Switzerland that have lots of gun ownership, but they have had rational gun laws. And here we know what we're looking at. If you go and you just look at who the mass shooters are, they're mostly male. 60 to 61 of the active shooters in 2021 are male. They're male between 25 and 34. If you go through the mass shootings in schools, it's even more specific. These are people who are basically just out of the age or still in the age where they themselves were doing the high school mass shooter drills because they're 17, 18, even 15 years old. They're fresh, somewhat fresh out of high school themselves. So they know where the kids are going to hide. They know what the kids are going to do because they did the drills too. They're around the same age. They are a majority, white males between a certain age. Like the profile is there. There's online profiles of the things they say, the threats they make. Like we know what we're dealing with, but we won't do anything.
Right. Well, look, first off, before I get into the analytical piece of this, let me just say, our youngest daughter graduated high school this week, and it is not lost on me that in, 8 years, there are going to be 19 families in Uvalde who should be celebrating the same way that we were, who we're not going to get to. And the reason they're not going to get to is because this country loves its guns more than it loves its children. This country loves the ability of an 18-year-old, the day they turn 18, to go buy a weapon of war, than they appreciate the right of a 10-year-old to become 11 or 12 or 13 or 18. So let's be very clear. The difference between Canada and the United States, Australia and the United States, New Zealand and the United States, every industrialized nation in the world versus us is that we fetishize weapons. And let's be very clear. The historical precedent for that, the reason that we are so obsessed with guns and personal gun ownership going back to the Second Amendment is because the founders were so afraid that Black people were going to rebel against enslavement, that indigenous people were going to rebel against being pushed off their land and killed and removed, that we wanted to make sure white men could have all the guns that they could possibly possess in order to put down the rebellions of the dangerous racial other. And so the irony is that we now have an incredibly dangerous country for everybody's babies, white babies, Black babies, brown babies, everybody's babies, because white men a couple hundred years ago decided we needed to have all the weapons that we could possibly have and enshrine that in the Constitution to defend against those people. And the irony is that now white folks, white children, white families, just as endangered. We buy all these weapons. In the wake of Obama's election, there was a big upsurge in weapons because folks were, oh, black dude's the president and they're going to come take our guns. After Ferguson, when Mike Brown was killed, the Ferguson uprising, everyone said, we got to go get all these guns. And the irony is that that increase in gun ownership did not lead to self-defensive use of weapons to prevent, burglaries or whatever. It led to an increase in suicide, an increase in homicide. We are a less safe nation for everybody's babies because of this obsession. And this obsession goes back hundreds of years. So we need to understand the connection between past and present and realize that we are a sick and broken culture. We are not the greatest nation on earth any longer. If we ever were, we are a nation committed to an ideology of death. And if we want to stop that and save our children, we are going to make a change. And I mean, children, students should be walking out of school in the fall, refuse to go to class until your parents and your grandparents do something to protect you. Your parents do not love you enough. Your leaders do not love you enough. And you shouldn't go to class one day until they decide to do something different. A general strike among young people is what is going to end this thing. And it may be the only thing that does that.